Hi, everyone. This is going to be a continuing episode series about the prophecy of Jesus in Matthew 5:19, that the one who would be called least by those who are in the kingdom of heaven for being an apostate, teaching those to not follow the law in Matthew 5:17 and 18, that person's name would be least. And the reason we looked into it is Tyler asked me, is there any proof positive that Jesus Christ ever called out Paul by name? And I said, absolutely. It's right there in Matthew 5:19. And it was exposed in the past. And I came across it, and I delved in more deeply, and I proved it conclusively from all the dictionaries and so on. And we have that in the prior episodes. But this is now just asking, who was the first person who put two and two together? Who put Matthew 5:19 together with 1 Corinthians 9:2, and then connected Paul to the prophecy of Jesus in Matthew 5:19? And it does appear that Johann Wieiss was the person, but last time I could not read the German, so I asked for anybody to provide help, and Katryn and Kurt did so with help on translation. They both deserve a big help. Thank you, and God bless them for their help. And in this episode, we're going to show you how it was put together. And for those people who carry a list in their hands or their pockets or whatever of what episode we're on episode 3 of who first connected 1 Corinthians 9:2 to Matthew 5:19. And the prior episode was, we looked at that exactly. We went through the evidence most probably shows it's Johann Wieiss, but I had an impediment. I could not read German. I couldn't even, it was an old Gothic German, couldn't decipher it. And it took the skill of both Katryn and Kurt to help, and they did a great job. And so we're going to look at their translation, and that will show us what was on the mind of Weiss when he wrote Der Christentum, 1917, at page 586 of that book. And the word he uses is kleiste, right there up on the top right there. All right, so this is the entire translation all the way from top to bottom that was provided by Kurt, but a lot of it was also done by Katryn previously, but in smaller portions. So both of them deserve equal recognition. It was very helpful. And I've highlighted certain parts I want to outline to everybody, but basically this is a Johann Weiss's work, and he is dealing with the book of Matthew. It's called Commentary on the Book of Matthew. And then he is going to refer to some interpretations he is having, that he can see the book of Matthew has negative things about Paul. So just to give you some references, he says when commentaries are being made in the book of Matthew, he says it doesn't let a certain rejection of Paul out of sight. So he's saying there's some sort of rejection that has happened to Paul, and it is being kept in sight by the author of Matthew. So he's suggesting that Matthew has an anti-Paul view. Now, I would say it's Jesus, because it's really Jesus' words, but German scholars tend to be very literal, like, okay, we don't buy into prophecy or whatever. It's Matthew. He wrote it, so he has to own it, even if it's Jesus saying things. So we have to know that's what German scholars think. They just don't give anybody credit other than Matthew, or they feel they can criticize the text more if they do that, I guess. I don't know. All right. Then it says, otherwise it doesn't let a certain rejection of Paul out of sight, like it should be understandable in Antioch, like the effectiveness of the Gentiles apostle, meaning Paul, there with a defeat in Galatians 2, verses 11, 14. So a lot of us don't realize that you could interpret Paul loses there, because he goes right after Peter, calls him a hypocrite, rebukes him, and all these things, which are absolutely going to put anybody in a normal organization on the outs with the leadership. You've taken the head guy and you've established him, criticized him. And he's saying here, if you study Peter's role in the book of Matthew, you'll see he takes a very strong place. He in these passages of Matthew 14, 17, 18, 16, you can screen capture this later and look at it. Peter is placed at the first of the 12 apostles. So when we are reading in Galatians 2, verse 11 and 14, that Paul put him down, he's saying this is a scandal and so on. And that's actually the words that other scholars, much earlier in the church, Ambrose or Ambrosiaster, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians 9, says this was a scandal. And he cross-references 1 Corinthians 9 with Galatians 2, verse 11. So the very same connections are being made here with the same sort of vocabulary as you'll see. So that's a big deal. So that is apparently when, according to Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, or Ambrose the Astor, if you take Erasmus's view that we're not sure who's the author, is saying that scandal that's reflected on Paul's side in Galatians 2:11 is obviously why Ambrose the Astor is saying that the apostles at that point determined Paul was a false apostle. We have a whole documentary series on that written Latin commentary that was only translated first time fully in recently by Mr. Bray, and he did not include some parts of it. So we went and dug it out of the Latin. So we have a whole series on that that verse. Anyway, so let's keep going. So if Matthew 28:19, the 12 apostles are sent to all Gentiles, he says, so this is completely ignoring of Paul, and it's hard to understand. So what he means is Jesus at the end of the gospel says, now my instruction is you to go to all nations and teach them everything I've commanded you. So he's saying it's hard to understand how Matthew would write this gospel and leave out mention of Paul, because clearly Paul exists at this point in time. I mean, Matthew probably doesn't write this until the third or fourth year after the crucifixion and ascension, right? So it takes time to write something like this and then even circulate it. So why doesn't he mention Paul? That's kind of what I think he's saying. And so he leaves him out. Well, maybe something's already happened by the time this is going on, and we don't know. But he's just trying to say there's some ignoring of Paul that he thinks is suggestive that Paul's on the outs with the apostles, even when Matthew's writing. As soon as the gospel was formed for its own mission in its own missionary area, and the threats to the teachers that want to lift the law, Matthew 5, verse 17 and 19, is best understandable as a silent antithesis against the ministry and teachings of Paul. So he's trying to say, so Matthew must know of Paul's apostasy already, because that's what it is. And I don't think so. I think that's really assuming that Paul's epistles are well known, and we can see that Luke is defending Paul up the yin yang until Acts 21, when he says he has James saying that Paul confronts Paul and says, Paul, we've heard rumors that you are an apostate. And he uses the word apostasia Moses. You have apostatized against Moses, and you teach the people not to even circumcise the Jewish people to circumcise their own children. I mean, we know that's false, right, Paul? And Paul says nothing. And he says, I have a plan. You have to go do this ritual vow, take a few guys, pay their way to do their Nazarite vows, and then everybody will know this is a big fat lie. That's what he says in the succeeding three verses. That's what Bishop James says to Paul. So that clearly shows to me there's a long period of time. We're talking years after Matthew's probably written his book. And so it's closed at the time that's all happening. So I think this gentleman, Johann Wieiss, is imagining a little too much is available to Matthew when he's writing this. So I believe this is Jesus prophetically giving warnings to us about the apostate person. He's going to tell his name, and he's going to give warnings that are unmistakable. Matthew 5, 17 and 19 is some person is going to come and teach you to not obey the least of these commandments, and he will be known as least by those in the kingdom of heaven, and greater those who teach you the law, and they will be known as great in the kingdom of heaven. So you can't mistake. Jesus is not praising the person who's has the name of least. He is putting him down, and it's clearly described in a form that fits apostasy. Teaching against keeping the law is apostasy. It's a crime under Deuteronomy 13, 1-10. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go take a look at it. Anyway, let's keep going. And then he says, and also if the word the smallest or least, in German, it's kleinste. So we looked it up, and it's defined as smallest, right? But then when you look up the word least in German, it means the smallest. So the word, if you put in the English word least, it'll tell you what the word for smallest is. So these are identical meanings. And so that's the kleinste is kind of one of those words that's both means smallest and least. And even in English, smallest can be least. This is the smallest thing I can think about. It's the same as saying it's the least I can think about. So he is now clearly saying in Matthew 5, 17 to 19, that if the smallest or least self-proclaimed allusion from the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 15:9. Okay, let's stop there. That's the proof that these two passages are being linked. Who linked Paul to uh, 1 Corinthians 15:9? That was Augustine, and Farrar had written a book where he was just reading the epistles of Augustine, and he noticed that Augustine had deduced Paul's name because Paul was alluding to his name by saying, "I am the least of the apostles." And when Augustine heard it, Augustine speaks Latin fluently, right? He knows that Paul's name Paulus means Poxolilis, and when you contract that to Paulus, like we have cannot, it contracts to can't. Same thing with Poxolilis, it contracts down to the word Paulus, and we showed you all the dictionaries in Latin from the 1701 dictionary and earlier 1577 Holyoke dictionary. So it contracts into this word Paulus, which in Greek is Polos, which is what we see in the New Testament. So he's clearly identifying with the same passage that Augustine had used to find what a self-proclaimed allusion. Paul is self-identifying or alluding to his true name means least, or smallest, least, kleinste in German. So that means he saw it, and that's all I wanted to prove. And that's what Kristen and Kurt helped me with. So we have that for sure going on here. And he's saying he sees Matthew is speaking in an anti-Paul way. And again, I think he's giving a little too much uh, credit to Matthew. Again, Matthew really can't know what you can't know. He's not a prophet. I mean, he can prophetically remember the words of Jesus, but Jesus didn't say, "I'm going to make 12 prophets to compete with me after I ascend to heaven." That's not what he wants. He doesn't want anyone competing with him. He wants to be the sole teacher, and he wants his words recorded, and the Holy Spirit will make them remember his words. They're not supposed to run around and be 12 different prophets. And if you don't know where that is, it's in the Clementine homilies where Peter it tells Clement, the Bishop of Rome, he says, and reproving the person that really is Paul, but it was edited by Rufinus to say Simon Magus. He says, we were commissioned not to have a message of our own, but to carry his message to the world. So we're apostles, which means we carry the message of someone other than ourselves. So he's trying to tell this Simon Magus character, who's obviously was originally Paul, but in the Latin rewrite by Rufinus, who translated the Clementine homilies, he just takes out Paul and he just substitutes Simon Magus. It's so brazenly obvious that it's Paul. So this is a conflict we can see there. They were trying to tell Paul, you can't be doing what you're doing. You're trying to give messages that people have to listen to as if you're speaking for God. And Jesus said, that's not right. We are not to be our own prophets. We're supposed to be the messengers. That's what the word apostle says. And that's violating our office to be the ones who now become prophets and take over his position. Imagine, by the way, if Jesus had 12 prophets competing with him and all their writings became the word of God, that would be exactly defeating Jesus. And so you can see what happens just with one person who's out of control, trying to take control and say, I'm speaking for God, but I'm never can quote Jesus, but I went to the third heaven. I was told I can't repeat anything he says. This is Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, approximately verse 7. He says, I wasn't allowed to tell you what it said. So that's where we see somebody's out of control and he is doing opposite what Jesus gave instructions to Peter, and Peter records in his discussions with Clement, and those are in the Clementine homilies. But unfortunately, Rufinus translated them in the 390s, and he translated it from Greek to Latin, and then he destroyed the Greek, and that's it. So we have to look at this romanticized version to make it make it just look like Paul is he's in there, but it's just completely making it look like it's a philosophical journey, and Peter's chasing Simon Magus, really Peter, from place to place to make sure correct his doctrine that's false and try to tell people this guy's teaching you false things. I mean, it's just unfortunately, we can't be sure too much, but we can be sure pretty much of those passages that involve Paul because they're just so starkly true. I mean, they're just obviously good reasoning of Peter, of what his role as an apostle was, for example. Okay, I digress. Anyway, so here we go. Just want to show you a couple more things. And then he goes that Jesus is on the same theme in Matthew 7:21-23. He calls it Matthew 7 verses 15-23, where Jesus is tightening against those who are lying pseudo prophets, false prophets, and Jesus says their miracles can't protect them. So again, what Weiss is bringing out is who else other than Paul would be an apostate whose miracles don't protect him, and even though and their confession of Christ doesn't protect them, and that's exactly what Jesus says in Matthew 7:21, Matthew 7, chapter 7, verses 21-23. He says, "Those who, call me Lord, Lord, or Master, Master." And then, they do mighty miracles in my name, and they cast out demons in my name, and do many wondrous works. But if you teach anomia, nomos is the law of Moses, is negative. If you teach against the law of Moses, you teach lawlessness, I will tell you, I never knew you. I mean, that is a real heavy weight on Paul's neck. Well, he is saying these passages fit in with this anti-Paul theme in these passages. Again, I think this is Jesus speaking prophetically, but he's a German critical scholar, and he's going to always talk, this is all Matthew doing this to try to undermine Paul. This key word, anomia, is encountered repeatedly in Matthew 7, verses 13-41. And this is the sentence that identifies an outbreak of a scandal, Matthew 18, verse 7. It's also in Revelation 2, verse 14, specifically that was related to eating meat sacrificed to idols and incest. Incest, the accumulation of the lawlessness, is in Matthew 24:12, one of the signs of the last days. So Jesus is saying one of the signs of the latter days that we're in is that you're going to see this is there's false prophets who are going to have signs and wonders come in my name. They're going to cast out demons, but don't believe they're from me because they preach anomia. They preach against the law of Moses, and this accumulation of lawlessness will now accumulate in the period of the last days. So we have been living in the last days ever since Paul came, because he was the one who first brought this. There was this pristine period, this early pure period where Paul wasn't that influential, and the 12 were doing fantastic. And you can see that all the way up through Acts 21:21, where James comes to Paul and says, many myriads, many tens of thousands of Jewish people have come to Christ, and they've heard this rumor that you are guilty of apostasia, Paul. Please take a look at the transliteral of Mountsy at BibleGateway.com. If you don't believe me, the word is there. And he says, Paul, you got to do this ritual vow to prove to everyone it's just a false accusation, and you do keep orderly, and you do keep the law. And Paul says nothing. He discloses none of his true beliefs that are clearly already in writing in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. So this is just a really, basically, he's sandbagging poor James. James has no idea. See, this is another thing. If James had prophetic insight, and automatically, I just want to show you something. We all assume that if he writes an epistle, he's writing an epistle from truth. He's not claiming that he has inspiration, because you have to say you have inspiration. So James does not have this clairvoyance that he knows that Paul's lying to him. But we know, the audience can, and you're going to say, well, what about Luke? Did he know? I think he did by this point. He was already suspicious. But remember, that as was recently proven, the book of Acts is not written for us. It's written to win and appeal the most excellent Theophilus, who's addressed in Luke 1:1 and in Acts 1:1-3. This guy is a magistrate helping Nero, according to Eumann in the early church records that he found in 1720 in his work on the origins of the book of Acts. And now Mr. Mount just coincidentally found out the same thing, just doing textual reads, that it's written for a judge to win a case and appeal. And that's exactly what's going on in Acts. Paul appeals in Acts 22:3, I think it is, to Caesar. And now at the end of Acts, he's gone to Rome, and he's awaiting his appeal. And that's why this book is even being written. The point that I'm bringing up is that means that Luke is doesn't have to tell you that he doesn't have to tell us anything about Paul being a true apostate at this point. He doesn't want to do that at all. He wants the Nero to think Paul is as orthodox as possible, because that's going to help the church not get outlawed by Nero reacting to this issue that Paul's friend had went into the temple, violated the sacred area of the temple in an uncircumcised state, and created this big hoopla, and the temple was defiled. And now the Jews go run uproar, and they try to seize Paul, saying, why did you bring your friend Trophimus in here? We got this defilement. That's also in Acts 21, and so that's his Luke's goal is to downplay Paul's apostasy but to not ignore that it was a factor at the same time. So give a little bit of information of why Paul's controversial to the Roman magistrate, but it doesn't mean it's provable. And in fact, that's why Luke highlights the fact that Paul did what James said to do. He did the ritual vow, and he proved to everybody he was keeping the law. And only you and I, and probably Luke secretly, but he's an advocate. He's like a lawyer. He's an advocate. His duty is to win this case and not try to question his client's ethics or morality at all. He needs to win for Christianity, because if this guy is a troublemaker and we get outlawed because of him, that's a real crime against Christianity. So he's going to defend him to the hilt and leave his suspicions in his, to himself, and not share that with this magistrate judge. That's not his job, to undermine his own client, Paul. So Paul's like a client in this point of time for Luke. Luke, and by the way, is very well educated. It's clear he knows a lot about history and all kinds of things. He's the most well educated person speaking in the New Testament. So my guess is he actually is an attorney, and he's not a doctor of medicine. He's a doctor of law, a Juris Doctor. Anyway, but I digress. Anyway, so this is what we get, and then he's going to tell us about warnings about vices. There are false messiahs and false prophets, and they tempt through signs and wonders to seduce select. Matthew 24:24, and that the way it's depicted in James's letter is there's Jesus is a second kind of Moses. Anyway, let me just see what else here. I just want to say one thing I thought was very interesting. I never thought about it. Is Weiss says that Jesus was actually saying the Sabbath is mandatory, because if you read Matthew 24:20, he doesn't quote it here, but what it says is, pray that when I return, it is not on a Sabbath day. Obviously, because that would be an inconvenient day to have to rush out of the house and get all your belongings and collect yourself. So the point is that he is saying, Weiss is saying that Jesus assumed we would all be keeping Sabbath all the way. The true church. Let me put it this way: most of the church does not keep Sabbath at all, but there are small segments that do, but those who are doing it are doing exactly what Jesus commanded, and that's what he's saying. It's a command implicit in the fact that he's saying, when I come back, pray it's not on a Sabbath, which means pray it's not on a day you're keeping Sabbath, not on a day that's been abolished, right? He knows it. He knows it is an institution that's eternal for all generations. That's what God said 11 times, that the 10 commandments and the law in general are eternal for all generations. So until the heavens and earth pass away and there are no more generations, no more giving and taking in marriage, the law, including the Sabbath day, are all fixed and cannot be removed. And that's a rock. And that was so interesting. And so even though he's a German critical scholar, he actually made some interesting observation I hadn't ever really realized. Okay, so I guess that's it. That proves that he was the first one to put it together, and he even said it meant there was an anti-Paulinism reflected in it. But what he doesn't do is he doesn't tell you much about this allusion to Paul's name being, what is that? So he didn't explain the whole thing I go through about Pauxililis and Paucus and all that stuff. He just simply tells you affirmatively it's Paul alluding to the meaning of his name, but doesn't break it down so that you can understand in any persuasive way that that's really true. So that's the only thing about the way he presented it that is different than what I would have done. But it still means he saw it and he identified it, and he identified it as part of an anti-Paulinism inside of the book of Matthew, which he saw in many, many places. But I would say it's all prophetically anti-Paul, not something Matthew could have known at the time he writes this gospel. All right, everybody, I hope that helps to understand who first came up with the connection. And it was Weiss, Johannes Weiss, in this book called the Crucentum. Let's see what it is. Here it is. There's the cover. So this is the man who deserves the credit for finding it and putting it all together. Der Crucentum, 1917. And you know what? Before I let you go, let me just stop. Okay, so now I want to show you that what Johann Wieiss said influenced his pupil, which was Rudolf Bultmann, And Bultmann is probably what his comment is going to be the one that radiates out and spreads the news about this. So let me just bring this up. Rudolf Bultmann acknowledged the plausibility of Weiss's contention, saying that Matthew 5:19 is a reference, quote, perhaps to Paul himself. Rudolf Bultmann, Theology of the New Testament. Now, this says 1972. This man is from the 1920s, so this is just the fact he's quoted in a later book. In Accord, David Hale in Gospel of Matthew, Grand Rapids, Erdsman's 1981, he notes, quote, many have found in this verse an attack on the work and teaching of Paul. And, quote, it is claimed the term least is a reference to Paul. That's in Matthew chapter 5, verse 19, Wikipedia. And I'll get into that a little bit more here. Bromley, this is a major editor, in the International Bible Standard Encyclopedia, Erdsman's 1995, mentions some make the, quote, argument that the warning in Matthew 15 about a man who relaxes one of the least commandments and teaches men so is a covert attack by stricter Christians, Jewish Christians, on Paul at 823. Now, again, that's almost like Christians talking like critical people like Johann Wieiss, and they ignore the fact this is Jesus speaking. It's not Matthew putting stuff in there. Jesus making a prophecy, and that's who we need to say. Why don't they say, many people claim that this is a reference, a covert attack by Jesus upon Paul. So they don't want to go there. But that's what who else could have known that this was a reference to Paul when Jesus said this? Nobody, because I've shown you, if you go back a couple episodes, it's just impossible that anybody could figure out what was on Paul's birth certificate, because the word Paulus stands for 6 different meanings, one of which means least. And let's see what else here. And then Matthew 5:19 in Wikipedia says, those who support this view that this verse is an attack on Paul, Matthew 5:19, about the least, who support this view see it as based on Paul's description of himself in 1 Corinthians 15:9, where he calls himself least of the apostles. Most scholars reject this. Now, they don't explain that it's because his name means least. See how they left out the most important, crucial thing to connect the dots? So you, the reader, can't figure out why they think that. Okay, so this is really disingenuous summaries and incomplete summaries. Okay. Anyway, regardless, most scholars reject this view as there is little evidence that the author of Matthew had read Paul's works. So see, they're going back to this idea that you can't have a prophecy of Jesus, which would explain it. So the answer is, I would say this evidence proves it's a prophecy. So I would turn this around on the Wikipedia people and the Christian authors who did this, is we have to always remember this prophecy. Jesus can know things that Matthew wouldn't. And that exactly is, thank you for the evidence here that you agree that Matthew couldn't have known about it. Therefore, the only person who knew this was Paul's name, the apostate was least, is Jesus of Nazareth. And okay, so I guess that's it. And then we will now, I think this topic is closed for the moment. There'll be other people maybe want to ask more questions about it, but we have established that Paul's name was identified by Augustine in the 300s with 1 Corinthians 9, by virtue of 1 Corinthians 9:2, to the Latin word Pauxililis or Paulus in its contracted form. But he didn't connect it to Matthew 5:19. Farrar detected what Augustine said, and he extracted from that it meant this word Pauxililis, because he had to do a little Latin research, but he didn't connect that to Matthew 5:19 either. And then it jumps all the way out to Weiss until 1917. It's finally somebody connects the dots that the word in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 2 means least, and he connects it to Matthew 5:19. And that's it. So somebody put it together, and that's the first person. That's what I think is the only first person who saw it. And then that got Bultmann to repeat it, and then Bultmann must have been read by somebody else. And these encyclopedias are mentioning some current of discussion about it, and they're vague about who's saying it, but obviously some people were saying it. And now I'm trying to say it loud in a forum on the internet that can gain some attention. So anyway, all right. God bless everyone. I hope that helps. Ciao. Take care. Bye.